Okay, so I'm back. I've cleaned off my turntable and my work area, got rid of, all the crumbs, so that's good. I cleaned off my spatula. And so what I'm going to be using now to frost the cake is I have my bowl of frosting. I have a large angled spatula, that's the one I like to use. And I have a nice little bench scraper, a metal bench scraper. That I'm going to use when I go to do my sides. That's going to help me make my sides nice and smooth. So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So when frosting a cake, you'll probably have often heard of a term called crumb coating. So that is where you put a thin layer of buttercream on the cake, let it sit, to kind of set all the crumbs, and then you go back and you frost it for real. Now, I've gotten into the habit of skipping the crumb coating part because I try to get my technique down to where I don't get any crumbs. Now, I've had some cakes that are just so crumbly, it doesn't work out. So typically what I'll do is I'll start out with the idea that I'm not going to crumb coat, and if I, halfway through I find, oh, this is not going to work, then I just spread the buttercream out nice and thin and let it sit for a little bit. So we'll see how this cake goes today. So the first thing I start with is taking a huge dollop of frosting and putting it on top of the cake. And this is where I just put a lot, because it'll just fill out over the sides. And I take my spatula, and again, having the turntable is nice because you can spin. And I'm just going to start spreading. Now I think the key to this, and the key to not getting any crumbs, is never let the spatula touch the cake. So never put the spatula out past where the frosting goes, and don't lift off. Try and kind of lift off to the side. Just always keep spreading. And having a nice thick layer is great because you can always, once it's covered, you can take off. But if you start out too thin, that's when you start getting the crumbs. So I'm just going to keep spreading, get it hanging over the sides real good. My top is basically good to go. And I'll come back at the end and, make it look all perfect. But no crumbs on the spatula yet, so I can wipe it into my bowl. I do keep this little bowl here, so if I do get crumbs on the spatula, I don't wipe it back into there. I wipe it into this bowl with my other scraps so that I don't get crumbs in my good buttercream, because then you'll definitely have crumbs on your cake. All right, so now I'm ready to start on the sides. So I'm going to take a big heaping bit of buttercream on my spatula and start working on my sides. So you can see I'm just sort of back and forth, and working it from the top towards the bottom, and then starts, kind of coming along the sides. And as I start to feel like it's getting a little thin, I just slid the spatula right off there so I can load it up with some more. Now it's going to look like there's a ton of buttercream on here, but we're going to go back and we're going to take some off. Like I said, working it down towards the bottom, and then if I'm not getting all the way towards the bottom, that's okay. I'm going to go back and around the bottom at the end as well and fill it in. I also find that round cakes are a lot easier than square cakes. That'll have to be a whole separate video. But square or rectangle cakes, trying to get the edges clean is always a challenge. And there are some tricks that I'm starting to pick up on how to do that. So maybe that'll be a part 2 of cake frosting. Alright, so I'm coming around to the other side. So I want to get my bottom. I'm going to work in a little bit. Oh, I got a couple of crumbs in there, and that's okay. That's where you can use a toothpick when you see them. Get them out immediately. Get them in your bowl there. That often happens when you're starting to get towards the bottom of the cake. And I'm just going to make sure I get all the way down. I have lots of frosting on here now, so I'm just making sure that all the way down to the bottom has frosting. All right. Okay, so now I have a ton of frosting on my cake, but it looks good. Now I'm going to start using my bench scraper. So I want it flat this way, and I'm going to push in slightly. Now, what I like to do is use the board as a guide. Now, it depends on how big your cake baked up, and that's also why sometimes trimming around the side with the knife like we did, where we went around the side, is good, because it takes a little bit away from the board on the bottom, so you have a little space where you can, kind of use it as a guide. So I'm going to see how that goes, but I'm going to start just gently and start taking some off, barely touching the board, up and down. And you can see as it comes around that I'm pulling off a good amount of the buttercream that's on there. Almost around to the other side. All right, now that looks pretty clean, so I am going to wipe it back into my bowl there, and that's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to do one more pass and see if I can get any more off without getting crumbs. I'm going to push it a little bit more in. Okay, so our sides are pretty straight. Now you'll see there's some imperfections in the buttercream, but I'm going to show you a little trick that I use to get it looking really nice and smooth. I'm going to clean up the top first though, and then we have to actually let it sit and let the buttercream sort of set for a little bit. So now that I have these little ridges up here on top, what I'm going to do is start to pull them in towards the center of the cake just very gently like that, so that it sort of cleans up the edge there. And then I wipe off any excess buttercream a little bit more in my bowl. And again, only if you don't have crumbs in it. If you have crumbs in it, do not put it back in your good bowl of good buttercream. Now I can see over here I actually need a little bit more. It's not quite all the way up to the edge. So what I'm going to do is actually add a little bit more buttercream right there. Sort of push it up a little bit. I'm going to go back over it with my bench scraper. I like to go all the way around just for consistency. There we go. And I cleaned up the edge nicely. Okay. So now once again I can pull in my edges and clean them up. It's looking good. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is let this sit, and how long to let it sit really depends. So I should have mentioned this buttercream is just a usual American buttercream, typical American buttercream with made of powdered sugar, a little bit of shortening, and some butter. If you have a buttercream where you add meringue powder, that's even better because meringue powder will actually make the buttercream crust over. I don't add meringue powder, but if I let this sit for a while, it actually does firm up enough on the outside that I can use what is called the Viva method. I always keep a nice roll of Viva paper towels handy. Viva is great because it doesn't have any quilting, no pattern. So what we're going to do is I'm going to let this sit, and then I'm actually going to show you how I use the Viva paper towel to sort of smooth out the buttercream. Now if you can't find Viva, don't have it, don't like the idea of using a paper towel, you can also use parchment paper. Get a nice strip of parchment paper, and same thing, you can kind of use it to smooth out the sides. So I'm going to let this sit. It depends on the humidity. If it's dry out, then it'll actually firm up and sort of crust over a little on the outside pretty fast. If it's a humid day, it may take a while before it's ready. So I usually give it a little touch test with a little bit of the paper towel. If it sticks to the paper towel, it's not ready. If it doesn't stick, then I know I'm good. So I'll come back in a little while and we'll check on it. So I'm back. I've let my cake sit for about 15-20 minutes, so I think it's ready to use what I've been calling the Viva method. So I cleared off my workspace, and I have my cake, cardboard I'm going to put it on once it's all smooth and ready to go and ready to be finished, and my pastry bag so I can put a border on it. So I have a Viva paper towel, and I like these kinds that come in like those half strips because I feel like it's an easier thing to handle. And really all I'm going to do is just press it lightly up against the side of the cake, kind of line it up, and then just with my hand very gently up and down, smoothing out any lumps and bumps that are on the cake, and gently peel the paper towel away. And you're going to start to see that the cake, any lines, any bubbles, any little holes in the frosting are going to start to smooth out. And like I said, if you find that it's starting to stick to the buttercream, that means you need a little bit more time and you should wait. You can also, I keep another one handy because if I do start to get just even a little bit sticking to it, it can then start to, you know, escalate and make the buttercream stick even more. So I think my sides look good. Now for the top, I just sort of, I'm going to use a clean one, lay it on top, and very gently just back and forth, smoothing out any imperfections. And again, you don't have to do this. I like to do it, especially if I'm making a wedding cake, so that it just looks as clean as possible. And Otherwise, you can also sometimes sit there, you know, tweaking how it looks with a spatula, trying to get it perfect, and you can spend a very long time trying to do that. I think it especially makes a big difference on the top, because on the sides, using that bench scraper, you can really get the sides pretty smooth. After I do the top, I do like to go back and do the sides, because sometimes doing the top pushes out the edges a little bit. So I'll go around and do my sides one more time. Okay, so it's pretty smooth, it's pretty good looking. So what I'm going to do next is put it onto a nice cake board. So as you can see, it's just bare, it's sitting on here. I mean, if you wanted to, you could move it onto a decorative plate that you have. I'm bringing this to someone's house, so I actually bought this decorative cardboard that I'm going to put it on. This is actually a 7-inch cake. It's kind of an odd shape. Normally it's 6 or 8 inches, but this is a 10-inch cake board, so this should be plenty big for this to go onto. So I'm actually going to use my pastry bag to squirt a little bit of buttercream on the board so that my cake sticks to it. And then I use my angled spatula, the big one that I frosted the cake with, to help lift it off and put it on the board and center it. If you have a really big cake, there are these larger cake lifters that I have one. It's really helpful to kind of maneuver a larger cake onto a cake board, but this one works just fine. And I'm just going to kind of scoot it to the edge a little. So I can get my finger under it and get the spatula under it. And then I use both my hand and the spatula to sort of guide it onto the board. And before I let go of my hand, I still have my hand underneath, so I can sort of line up and center the cake. And you can always maneuver it after it's off. That looks good. And slide it a little bit. Alright, so now, very gently, I'm going to pick my cake again. Sometimes it's good to use the spatula to help get your hands underneath. You can lift the cake up back onto the turntable. You want to make sure it does eventually, once you put that buttercream under there, it will help it stick a bit, but in the beginning it does still slide around a bit. And as you can see, I'm actually going to use the spatula to scoot it because it did shift. And clean it off. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, it'll start to settle. Try not to move around too much. Right now I'm going to put a border on. And I thought I'd show you that as well. So I have a pastry bag with a tip number 21. That's a star tip. And I like to just typically do, I'll do it starting here so you can sort of see it. The typical shell border. To do a shell border, you start at an angle, so about a 45-degree angle just above the surface of the board. You start to squeeze to sort of build up, and then you pull down and release the pressure of the pastry bag as you're pulling to make that nice little shell looking thing. Then you start right where you left off again, sort of build up, raise the pastry bag, and then bring it down. And do that all the way around. Okay, I'm all finished with my border. My cake is pretty much done. I have some little decorations I'm going to put on top before I bring it to my friend's house, but I hope this video of how I tort and frost and fill my cakes was helpful. If you have any questions about how to do any of this, you can always contact me, Jen, at 80cakes.com, and please check out my website, www.80cakes.com, for lots more tips and videos. Happy baking!